proceeding exactly according to plan and to time, as you'd expect, of course, and Mercer Street is where we're moving now. I think there are lovely stories to do with the casket and the way in which it came together. It's a gift from the Funeral Directors Association of New Zealand. The president is John Duncan, who is leading the casket along with the guard commander here, and it is a beautiful piece of work. It's made of kauri, and understandably enough, the Ministry of Culture and Heritage said, I wonder, can you make two for us? Because one has to go to France, and we need the other one here for the bearers and servicemen to practice and rehearse and so on and so on. And so two were made. And inside, which we will never see, but you have, Alison, isn't it, is a smaller casket which actually holds the skeletal remains of the warrior, and it's made of totara. And each of them have very moving words inscribed on a plate in them. And they were the work, all three caskets, because that's what it amounts to, of Bob Jones, who works for Westland Funeral Services in Greymouth. And Bob is himself a returned serviceman. He saw service in Borneo and Vietnam, and I know regards this as the most important assignment of his working life, and it's beautiful craftsmanship.
When we were attending the sealing of the copper box, which is inside the coffin, which is inside that casket, the Kaumatua who was with us, Kaumatua Reverend Bert McLain, with the Defence Forces, also addressed the soldier, as Air Marshal Bruce Ferguson had done. And Bert McLain said that he told him that when he was talking with the soldier, he told him that the coffin that we've just been mentioning, he said to him that the coffin was his waka, that the people of New Zealand had brought for him to take him home, and that the New Zealand contingent who was with him was there to ensure that the waka, there to crew the waka, and to ensure it a safe journey home. And that imagery, of course, for a New Zealander is powerful, because with our small islands surrounded by sea as they are, the image has real meaning. And I thought then, when he was talking about that, of those big ships that the men had left New Zealand on, and it was lovely to have the image of a waka also bringing him home, because it's very likely that this soldier knew and loved some part of the New Zealand coast.
Casket now just coming past the Civic Centre, and chance to mention those who are following this: senior military officers from all three services, and warrant officers with them. And also marching there is some of the people who played a significant part in today's events. General Sir John Willsey, whom we heard reading the Rossetti poem in the cathedral. And marching beside him is Colonel Andrew Renton Green, who is the chairman of the coordinating committee which has made arrangements, and is also the guardian, if you like, in that he's chairman of the National War Memorial Advisory Council as well. Alongside them, Colonel Jesse Gunn, who was with Alison in France, the Director of Veterans Affairs, and a former Chief of Defence Force, Air Marshal Carey. So those are, if you like, the large players from today's events, and Behind them, people whom we see every year on Anzac Day, laying wreaths, representing the 28th Maori Battalion, Charlie Bell. With him, Larry Boyle, the naval representative. Gov Gray from the RSA Maori ex-service group. And the new president of the Royal New Zealand Returned and Service Association. I shouldn't call him new, he's appointed this year, Colonel John Campbell, retired, of Dunedin, who of course was in your party.
He was in the party that went to France, and of course it was hugely significant for him because the RSA have wanted this for 60 years. It's been 60 years since they first mooted the idea that they would like to bring a soldier home to symbolize all soldiers who never came back. And so today is a great day for the Return Service Association.
On our way now into Cuba Street, when we'll follow along that main sort of commercial highway of the capital. Alongside those who are following the casket are representatives of all the theatres of war. We've tended to concentrate, understandably enough, on World War I and France, because that's where our warrior was and where he fought. But there are there, marching with him now, people who served in Malaya, in Vietnam, in Korea, people who were in the merchant navy in 2 world wars, people who served in the Gulf War, in East Timor, on peacekeeping missions in Zimbabwe when it was Rhodesia, people who've been with the multinational forces and observers in places like Sinai, a former chair of the National War Memorial Council, Air Vice Marshal Robin Klitschko, and others who've served in Vietnam. And bringing up almost the rear are representatives, if you like, of all of us with special pride in the valor, the bravery, the strength, the courage, the commitment of New Zealand soldiers. And there are their descendants of the Travis family. Dick Travis got a VC and military medal, and the Croix de Guerre, and as an RSA member was telling me earlier, they ran out of gongs to give him. An Otago man who enlisted under a false name so he could go, became a scout in World War I, was famous for knocking out machine gun forts, died in France. There's also there Mr. Dennis Malone, a descendant of Colonel William Malone, whose letter was read out by Her Excellency in the church in the cathedral earlier on. Gary Tom Shilson from Wellington College is there as well. He went to the New Zealand Memorial at Gallipoli not so long ago and saw the name of his great uncle and made the pilgrimage. David Mackenzie is there. I don't know whether David lives in South Canterbury, but he has strong connections because he's there as a descendant of Charles Upham, the double VC, the quiet man who was so brave.
I think one of the things that struck me about this is that while there are the heroes that we know about, this is also a day to remember the many thousands of men whose names may not be recorded in the history books, whose acts of bravery and strength of spirit we may never know about. People who stayed with their mates who were dying, putting their own lives at risk. People whose acts of courage may only be known to them.
And I think, as the Prime Minister suggested in her address, it's not just that, Alison, is it? It's all those who waited and wondered and feared and had to suffer no news or the very worst of news. And yes, how many mothers and fathers lost how many sons, how many children, fathers and uncles.
I think that's one of the things that really struck me when I looked at these thousands of names on the many memorials around the Western Front, and I've felt it in other parts of the world too, that you look at those names, and where there may be a single name, you think of the huge numbers of people who are affected if you multiply that by their families. You know, one person dies and there are 5, 10, 15 people whose lives are changed forever. And certainly in terms of thinking of the people who waited at home. And the women. I think it's been mentioned before in news reports while we were in France that there were only 2 women present, myself and Colonel Jessie Gunn, when the coffin was sealed in Arras. And we wept and got outside, and I said to Jessie, you know, I feel we were weeping for all the mothers and sisters and sweethearts and daughters. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but it just suddenly struck me afterwards that you can think only about men in a commemoration like this, and of course a woman's view is of another side of loss. We commemorate women here today too, of course. There are New Zealand women who have served overseas in war, mainly as nurses in the 2 first wars, and VADs, of course, in the Second War. TUIs, I mean, VADs in the first, TUIs in the second. And there are 22, I think it's 22 New Zealand women who have been killed while on active service. And 10 of those are in unknown graves. The majority of those nurses who went down with the Marquette in the First World War when it was torpedoed and remain in the sea.
No, you're quite right. He carries the Maori of every New Zealander who died, and indeed every New Zealander who served. I like the fact that on his, in front of the casket, the insignia bearer carries the cushion with his medals, his insignia. And they're not for great gallantry, you don't do that. They are for service. And to show that it's not just sort of the fact of being at war, but all those who stayed behind and those who came back. Among them is the RSA badge in gold, which is given to very few people indeed, but which says, in a way, you know, your service has been while you've been lying there in France. And as well as that, it's also a sign of our history, I suppose, that the 3 of his medals, 4 in fact, are called British medals. He's got the 1914-15 star there, the British War Medal of 1914 to 18, and the Victory Medal, and then a World War II medal, and then an Operational Service Medal for all those who've served since then. Swinging round now the procession, and very soon we'll be onto that long hall up Taranaki Street, which takes us south and which climbs its way up towards the hillside on which the National War Memorial sits.
I think as I watch these men marching too, of the marching of soldiers, generations of soldiers, and particularly in the First World War, they often had to march to where they served. Their diaries record this. In France, they may have got trains to certain centres, but then they often had quite long marches, and they did it all in all conditions, carrying what little gear they had with them. So while today's walk through Wellington may seem to be going on for a long time. It's reminiscent of the marching of soldiers through generations. I was talking before about the people of France after the handover at the Longueval Memorial in this very small French village. It could have been a local hall in Geraldine or Fielding or Kerry, anywhere in New Zealand really. And the people had a reception in their town hall. And there was New Zealand wine, which I think our embassy provided, and some food and speeches. And a beech tree was given. 2 beech trees, I think, were given from the people of New Zealand to the people of Longueval. So in the small village near where the soldier has come from, there will be 2 New Zealand native beech trees planted. And I wouldn't be surprised if in generations to come they become a point of pilgrimage for young New Zealanders too, who may go to see the memorial at Longueval and the Caterpillar Valley Cemetery, where the soldier came from. And they can see in future years the beech trees growing tall in memory of the handover from the people of France to the people of New Zealand of our unknown warrior.
And already members of the public gathered around. We're looking over the Carillion Tower there at the National War Memorial. And so there's just the slow march up Taranaki Street, turn into Buckle Street, which you can see below us there.
There's one little story I don't think I did tell before, Ian, about the handover ceremony. I'm looking at a rather grey Wellington today, and there was a grey chill over the Somme and over the Longueval Memorial for most of the time that we were there. But an extraordinary thing happened during the actual handover ceremony. We were standing and the wind was cold. I don't know what the prevailing cold wind is on the Somme, but it was coming from wherever that was. And during the service, I suddenly became aware that there was sun on my back, and the sun had broken through, and it was warm. And it was quite extraordinary because there the sun shone down onto the small group of people standing around this very simple memorial. And then as the hearse left and went up the road, and as I said, went under that extremely impressive archway of Taiaha in the distance, the sun disappeared and we were back to the chill of autumn.
Yes, somehow those things are, I know I've been asked by a number of the folk preparing for today what we would do if there was wet weather. And well, of course, it will proceed. And I have to say, I also said, and I'm pretty sure there will be wet weather, because the elements sort of work with us to acknowledge these things. And ngā roimata o te whenua, you know, the land cries to... But maybe that's what happened overnight, because Wellington was quite wet, and that's right, and gusty, and really, and that's why our warrior was lying in state in Parliament. So these things do conspire together.
It was interesting too, because while we were in France, there was no rain in any of the 3 days that we were there going through these ceremonies. And then when the hearse and we got to Lille airport and boarded, as we taxied onto the runway to take off from France, the rain started. And so there was rain as the warrior left France, and we all thought that was absolutely appropriate. All the young men and women who came with the Defence Forces to France, it should be said, were volunteers. They all volunteered for this particular job. obviously all the people that you see there weren't in that group, but many of them are still, seeing through the warrior's journey to its very end. And we've spoken before of the great sense of responsibility and pride that they have.
A number of those taking part in today's ceremonies have volunteered, put their names forward, deliberately said, territorials and the like, I want to be there.
Yeah.
So this is a day to remember and tell your grandchildren about, that is for sure. And I imagine you became quite a tight group with common purpose while you were travelling.
There was very much that, and I think it was interesting because I haven't had much to do. I work a lot with returned men from the Second World War and record their stories, but I've had very little to do with the modern Army and Navy and Air Force. And yet, coming from different cultures as we did, we and the media, other media there, became a very cohesive group, I think, and a number of people in the military who have been on commemorative trips before to places like Casino and North Africa commented that this group was different. There was a singleness of purpose in the people who went to get, as we started to call him after we'd had the handover, our boy. And we were ready when we went to leave France. I think everybody who was on that plane knew that we had one single purpose, and that was to get our boy home.
That's right, that's rather nice, isn't it? As you say, strong on the ceremonial and the symbolism, but when it comes to it, it's family.
Exactly.
We've taken a while, as you've been saying, Alison, to get our unknown warrior home. Many other nations have done it well before us. I think that, well, I know that the first was on the second anniversary of that armistice in 1918. That was on the 11th of November 1920 that the British brought home an unknown warrior and buried the remains in Westminster Abbey. And on the same day the French did likewise, and their tomb, of course, lies right under the Arc de Triomphe at the end of the Champs-Élysées. And other nations have done the same. The Americans, the Italians, Belgians in 1921, Prague and Belgrade in 1922, and then Warsaw and Athens. But interestingly, and it's a comment on our life as it was then, that when the idea was proposed here in 1921, the then New Zealand government said no, because of course all New Zealand dead are honoured in the Westminster Abbey. So it was what Michael Joseph Savage was to say in 1939. Where Britain goes, we go. We were part of an empire, and it's maybe a sign. It is certainly a sign that there is a national identity of New Zealand emerging. That we say no. Now is the time to bring back our own son to his and our soil. I
couldn't agree more. It's as if this is a really strong indication of how grown up we are now, as a country of a number of different peoples. There he is. There's the route up Taranaki Street. We're just at the corner, coming up to the corner there, and soon they'll turn into Buckle Street to the National War Memorial, where the tomb, the beautiful new tomb, has been prepared, and the final part of this warrior's long journey will take place.
And as you can see, the escort has split into two columns so that there will be room for the actual casket and the attenders to turn into Buckle Street and make their way just the short distance along Buckle Street to the National War Memorial.
There's something else which has struck me as we've been looking at this, and which I've thought of and talked about a lot with people over the last week or so. And it's probably important to say that this is not about glorifying war. This is not a glorification of it. If anything, it's an indictment. And I think that what's happening here is, as the Prime Minister said, we are integrating into who we are the full story of our past. The more than 30,000 New Zealanders who have died in war are part of who we are, Pākehā and Māori. And it's acknowledging that as we move on into the future.
Take a moment now that the band has stopped playing to acknowledge the music that they gave us as the casket marched through the city. They were slow marching to music called Fern Leaf headstones, which, as you can gather, very much a New Zealand piece of music. It was composed by the Deputy Bandmaster of the New Zealand Army Band, Staff Sergeant Dwayne Bloomfield. A special funeral march for today's homecoming. And if you've ever seen the pictures or if you've ever been, you'll know exactly what Fern Leaf headstones means. It's a strong reference to those thousands of white headstones in cemeteries in northern France and in Belgium, where the fern leaf in a circlet means a Kiwi lies here.
Before his disinterment, this warrior would have lain under a headstone that said simply, "A New Zealand soldier known unto God," which were the words that were written and are still written on the headstones of all unknown soldiers buried. And of course, alongside him there were 4 others, and their headstones still say that. The headstone where this soldier lay has now been replaced by another one, another beautiful white headstone that tells of his passage from there to here. And it says, a New Zealand soldier known unto God, used to lie in this grave in the Caterpillar Valley Cemetery on the Somme, but he now lies in Wellington, New Zealand, at the National War Memorial, which he will do before the end of today.
Saluted by his escort as he comes through, and then the last little climb up the hill to the National War Memorial. There, the Governor-General, the Prime Minister, all sorts of distinguished visitors, and his bearers will finally place him in what is a quite stunningly beautiful tomb.
It's likely, I think, in years to come, Ian, that National War Memorial will become a place of pilgrimage too. In France, in Longueval, actually at the reception in the village hall, I met some New Zealanders who'd come across from London for the service, for the handover, and they of course came to the reception as well, because in a country hall anyone can turn up at the reception. And they said that as soon as they get back to New Zealand, they'll actually be coming to Wellington. 2 of them came from here, but the others will travel here, and they will come to the National War Memorial to see where the soldier's lying.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? It's been France and Gallipoli till now.
That's right, that's right. And Italy.
Yes, you're quite right.
And North Africa. And Greece and Crete.
But especially the pilgrimage, yeah.
Oh, but the pilgrimages certainly have been Gallipoli, yes. One of my hopes is that there will be much more awareness